as Martin said, I work for Murray Local Land Services based in Albury. I'm actually a social scientist now. I work in the strategic planning group, but in a previous life I've been a field botanist for many years, working throughout Victoria, and in that time I had the fortune to be involved with the preparation of a couple of revegetation guides, and that's what I want to talk about today. So I'm going to give a little bit of background into my experience with the guides. I'm also going to step you through some of the main content in those guides and explain where I think the revegetation guides and particularly vegetation profiles could fit with the new restoration standards. So there's Albury, that's that little starred area on the map. It's on the border of Victoria and New South Wales, in case you don't know. And people doing revegetation work are very fortunate down there because they can choose from up to 4 different revegetation guides. The first one of those was done in north-east Victoria in 1994, and it was the inspiration of a woman named Fleur Stelling, who's lived in the area, still lives in the area. So she produced the north-east one in 1994, then moved on to the southwest slopes of southern New South Wales in 1998. Then Fleur went to the Goulburn Broken area and prepared a reveg guide there in 2001, but then she had to go overseas, and so that's when I stepped in to finish off that project. And then in 2002 I was involved with the Riverina Reveg guide associated with Charles Sturt Uni. So these guides followed a fairly standard format. They covered a defined area, either a catchment management area as they did in Victoria or on a bioregional basis in New South Wales. Part 1 of the guides contained contributions from a number of experts writing about various topics associated with revegetation. And Part 2 contained the vegetation profiles, and that was where we broke the larger region into a series of sub-regions and prepared maps and profiles. And Part 3 included species descriptions for all the species that were listed in the veg profiles. So basically this whole process was designed to make it easier for people undertaking reveg projects to work out what the most appropriate species for them to use in their particular areas would be. So we had this 3-step process. We broke the big region into a number of smaller regions, and they were set up on purely pragmatic grounds to make it simpler for people. So the boundaries used roads, we labelled them with names that people understood. And we made sure that within each of those sub-regional areas there were generally not more than about 10 or 12 vegetation communities. And that was just to make it a simpler process for people to choose from. So within each of the sub-regions we then set up these series of triplet landforms and veg community sets so that people could again start to look around their landscape and work out where they were sitting and where their reveg project was going to happen. And we intended that to be used so that people could actually stand out on site and say, oh, there's a river over there, or there's a sandhill over there, and I'm on the plain in the middle. And it would help them just to hone into what sort of veg community they were standing in and wanting to do their reveg in. And then the third part of the process was to prepare these long lists of local Indigenous species that people could use in those situations for reveg. And I just had to add this in. We had these really nice illustrations just to add a bit of aesthetic content to the profiles, and I have to point out Martin was the artist that did all this work. And we wanted those to give some sort of visual representation. A lot of people sort of respond to visual cues, and so these diagrams just help to illustrate and help people understand where they were. You'll see that some like the creek lines and secondary floodplains occurs in 2 sets of triplets. That's because you could stand out in the landscape near a creek line or a secondary floodplain, flood runner, and you could see different sequences of landscapes on either side of you. So that's why some things were repeated more than once, or occurred more than once. And then you probably can't see all the detail on this, but you don't need to. On the right-hand side of this slide is a rough photocopy of one vegetation profile. It's from the Tupple area. It actually spreads over one A3 page, so there's quite a lot of information on it. And if you look at the red headings on the side, that tells you what sort of information the profiles actually contain. So there's the heading, there's the label of the landform triplet, there's the profile diagram, there's a brief description of each landform, a label for each veg community and a brief description of it. And importantly, and it goes back to what Davo was saying this morning, for all of these profiles we identified a local example where people could just go down the road, as it were, could have still been many kilometres away, but it was down the road, to see an existing example of the highest quality vegetation for that veg community in that area. And in the Riverina, most of them are on TSRs, not surprisingly. And then we listed all the species that we recommended for use in reveg. These tended to be common species. We didn't include many rare or threatened species because we didn't want people to go searching for them to propagate from them. We didn't include species that were difficult to propagate, so there were no orchids, no saprophytic plants. We didn't have any non-vascular plants either. So it's just a simple guide and more than enough for people to work with. And then every species that was listed in a profile was also described in the back of the book, and that provided more information for people to understand, the habit, its height, preferences, flowering times, information like that. So I think that the Riverina Reveg Guide has over 300 species described in it. And so when I was preparing this talk, I thought I'd go and ask a few people in my neighbourhood who I know use Reveg guides about how they value them and what they use them for. In our area, they're used by landholders, they're used by land care community groups, used by agencies, consultants, all sorts of people are using these guides. One of the main reasons they're using them for is to select local species for revegetation projects. That's pretty obvious. But they also use them to provide clues where there's a proposal to do reveg in what's basically an open paddock, no remnant vegetation left, maybe just the odd plant. They can use these guides to try and pinpoint what that landscape might have looked like and what they should aim for with their revegetation project. They're used for rehabilitation works, they're used with direct seeding projects and for large-scale seed production orders. And interestingly, I found out that some people use the papers in the front of the guide to prepare fact sheets on particular topics. And this is a picture that Kylie Durant from Holbrook Landcare sent me. This is her copy of what's on there, right? She uses the Southwest Slopes Reveg Guide, and you can see from that it's well used, well loved. I did offer to get her another copy, but she said no, she didn't need it. She's happy with that one. And she described it as being the key resource for her. And Kylie's involved with the Slopes to Summit project, thank you. Very large-scale project, working with landholders. She uses it all the time. So really, to use investment sort of parlance, there has been an exceptional return on investment from these revegetation guides. A lot of them are over 10 years old now, but they're still very much used, very current, very relevant. Okay, so now I want to get to the real point of the discussion, thinking about how the reveg guides and the veg profiles in particular might inform and help with the new restoration standards. And of course I had to go no further than Principle 1, which talks about the need to base restoration practice on appropriate local Indigenous reference ecosystems. And I looked through the guide to see what the key elements of the Indigenous reference ecosystems were. So there's the list that I came up with from the introductory text. And I thought about how each of those might be, or how the veg profiles might relate to those. They talk about local Indigenous plants, that's their purpose. So they're certainly addressing that element. They're not addressing animals, they're not addressing non-vascular plants, but they are doing the vascular things. They don't give a complete list of species that occur in an ecosystem, but they do provide a suite of the common species that are suitable for revegetation. they were done 10, 15 years ago. We weren't thinking about climate change, we weren't thinking about species moving around then, so we didn't consider species from adjacent locations, but arguably adjacent subregions had similar species, similar communities, maybe different species. So there was a little bit of that, but not much, and that wasn't the intent. There's a little bit of information about structure, in as much as the profiles talk about tall trees and smaller trees and shrubs and ground covers and so on. Information about ecological processes and dynamics is not covered in that at all. It was never intended to be. Similarly, for information about successional states, you wouldn't find that in the reveg guides either. But you do find the reference sites listed for every single profile. There's at least one reference site that was nominated, and they were nominated on that day. And arguably the veg profile itself is a conceptual model. And the other thing about the profiles is they're all dated. So all of these works were done as projects at a particular date. So I'm going to put my social scientist hat on here and draw from some information that the Behavioural Insights team have suggested. And this is a quick checklist that they suggest people use when introducing policies or something like a standard. It's the EAST acronym. And their view is that if you want to make people do something, and in this instance, we want to make people base their restoration practice on an appropriate local Indigenous reference system, their advice is make it easy. So make it easy for people to do the right thing. So make your tools something that guides people to do the right thing. Don't put up the impediments, do the right thing. Make it attractive, and I don't necessarily mean make it look nice. I mean make it draw people to do the things that are important and clear out some of the clutter. If there is clutter, don't confuse people with lots of detail. Just get them to focus on the important things. Make it social. And in this sense, I'm saying make it social, not in terms of being so much a chatty thing, but use social norms. So build on existing social norms that are there and use those to demonstrate that other people are already doing the desired behaviour. And certainly in the part of the world where I come from, we can claim that there is a strong social norm there associated with revegetation because people always go to these guides for direction. And the other thing is to make it timely. Reveg guides or vegetation profiles could be a very useful tool, I would suggest, when people are starting to plan their revegetation projects. Right at the start, when they need to do the planning, make this available to people so that they know that they are addressing the requirements of the restoration standards by working towards the Indigenous reference ecosystem. Quickly, a few problems. There's incomplete coverage. We're very lucky around Riverina, Southwest Slopes area, we've got it. I don't know what guides are out there, but I'm sure they're all different. They may not have all the elements that are desirable. They were all produced in hard copies. This is the Riverina one. I think we've got about 10 copies left of that, and it's going to be very expensive, so no one's going to reprint it. They are also available on the web, but these were all done around the turn of the century. Web technology was pretty basic then, so they're all pretty clunky, and we could do a lot better with them now. The Riverina Reveg Guide was set up as a database tool, so it's actually set up to be updated and managed, but I have to stop, don't I? Okay. Big point. We need custodianship for these things. At the moment, they've just been prepared as single projects. They're sitting there, they're being used, but one day they're going to run out or someone's going to take down the website. There's no coordinated custody for them, and I think that's something that we could all think about. Okay.